Putin likes to make himself out to be the strong man, but he looks weak, if I'm honest, every time he engages with the North Koreans, and this feels a little bit desperate. As you know, there was a mutual assistance agreement that was set up in the summer, and this is kind of a manifestation of that. What is North Korea getting in return? We don't know. Is it assistance with its nuclear program? Is it other military expertise? Is it sanctions assistance? We don't know. But this is clearly a pretty cool-hearted trade going on. On the battlefield, it still feels like escalation, doesn't it? Because it's one thing to provide ammunition. It's another thing to put troops into the fight.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Major General Rupert Jones, who's previously the UK's most senior commander in Iraq and joint-led coalition forces against ISIS. Rupert Jones, welcome.
Very nice to see you again.
I wondered if we could start just this morning. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has in a way confirmed now that North Korean troops have been deployed to fight alongside Russians in Kursk. Some reports suggest they are already arriving on some fronts in Ukraine. We had the reports of others killed in Ukraine only last week or the week before. What sort of impact are these troops going to have in the first instance on the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first thing to say, we shouldn't be terribly surprised by this announcement. It's been a poorly kept secret, hasn't it, with a huge amount of speculation. Coming from the Ukrainians, and then counter comments. So this, and indeed Putin all but confirmed it in a kind of cryptic response at a media interview a couple of days ago. So I guess no real surprise about the fact of it. So what does it mean tactically? Well, we are told, or we understand, that these are likely to be special forces. I use that term very loosely, but they're kind of higher end capability North Korean troops. Well, I mean, they add fresh numbers, and we know that Russia is actually struggling a little bit with numbers. It's certainly been struggling with motivated troops, high quality motivated troops. So on the battlefield, it's not so much, there's figures of 2,600 troops perhaps in Kursk, don't know. But it's not just another 2,600 Russians. It's 2,600 better motivated, probably better trained North Koreans who, let's be honest, have a pretty strong motivation for performing in the battlefield, because the North Korean regime is more than capable of holding them to ransom in a pretty unpleasant way in terms of threats to their own family and things. We know how the North Korean regime works. So these are likely to be troops who really try and take the fight to the Ukrainians. Would I prefer to be up against a Russian conscript or a North Korean? I'd go for a Russian conscript every day of the week. So, I think they're going to bring some, some pretty fearsome effort to the battlefield. The level of their operational experience is likely to be pretty limited, but I wouldn't underestimate them.
And I mean, at this time, it's reported there are around 12,000 DPRK troops available to Russia. The Institute for the Study of War suggests that Russia has, that many casualties roughly in a week. So is Russia likely to funnel these troops straight to the front?
Yes. Who knows what Kim Jong-un and Putin have bartered, if you like, and what are the kind of, they will have come with what we in the West would call some national caveats. You can use them in this way, you can't use them in that way, and we clearly don't know what the nature of that is. I would have thought Putin will be quite cautious to use them in a way that's going to lead to very heavy casualties. Again, go back to my earlier analogy. Would Putin prefer to lose 1,000 of his own troops or 1,000 of these North Koreans? Cool calculus tells him he'd prefer to lose another 1,000 of his own troops. No one seems to care very much in terms of the kind of wider Russian opinion, whereas losing 1,000 of the North Koreans is going to have strategic implications, or certainly high level implications. So I think he'd be pretty cautious about how he uses them. And therefore, there's a question about the degree to which is their deployment more for strategic value than for tactical value. All the indications are that they're being deployed into Kursk, so in Russia. Um, and there'll be good reasons for that. Is that because that's what Kim Jong Un has insisted upon? I don't want my troops fighting inside what we internationally all recognise to be Ukraine. Or is it for other reasons? Is that where he needs kind of good fighters, or all of that to play for? But as you're suggesting, I mean, firstly, 2,600 troops or your full 12,000 is a very small quantity in the greater scheme of this conflict. But secondly, as you're suggesting, I think that there'll be caution about how they are used, at least in the first instance.
And the arrival of North Korean troops in Russia has caused a level of international alarm, especially in East Asia. How much of an escalation will this be?
Yeah, there's lots of levels to this, aren't there? So North Korea has been uh, actively supporting Russia in the fight, for a couple of years. They've provided since 2022 very significant amounts of artillery ammunition, and then ballistic missiles from last year, kind of offered. So they're already actively involved. That's the first thing to say. It's interesting, what it points to. Putin likes to make himself out to be the strong man, but he looks weak, if I'm honest, every time he engages with the North Koreans, and this feels a little bit desperate. As you know, there was a mutual assistance agreement that was set up in the summer, and this is kind of a manifestation of that. What is North Korea getting in return? We don't know. Is it assistance with its nuclear program? Is it other military expertise? Is it sanctions assistance? We don't know. But this is clearly a pretty cool-hearted trade going on. On the battlefield, it still feels like escalation, doesn't it? Because it's one thing to provide ammunition; it's another thing to put troops into the fight, which is what North Korea appears to be doing. So, I mean, Lukashenko, as you know, the Belarusian president, a couple of days ago, in denying that it was happening, said it would be an act of escalation. Absolutely, right. Would certainly be an act of escalation, and it is undoubtedly, therefore, an act of escalation. I think in the broader sense, you then have to look at where it lies alongside the West's broader adversaries, if I can call them that. So China is the pacing threat, Russia, North Korea, Iran. All of those are to some degree aligned in support of Putin, in support of his war aims. Now, some options are closing down. Clearly, the Iranians have taken a very big hit recently at the hands of the Israelis. That I think will, genuinely, their military capability appears to have been diminished. And I think they'll think pretty cautiously before they start exporting materials to somebody else's fight when they're feeling a bit denuded themselves. So all of these kind of interlink in terms of how Russia is trying to create a little axis around these powers, and that's before you get into the kind of wider conversation about what happened at BRICS in the last few days.
Well, you mentioned BRICS there, of course. China, at of all places, the BRICS summit, did issue a sort of warning of sorts, that the war in Ukraine shouldn't be expanded. When you talk about other allies being less able to support Russia at the moment, can Putin afford to upset China in this way?
No, and I think that's a really good point. Um, the daddy, if I can call it, in this relationship between those four states I just referred to, is undoubtedly China. No question. The days when Russia lent into a relationship with China as the senior member are long gone. And I think back to when Russia and China were conducting joint exercises before the current invasion of Ukraine. and the Russians and Putin would sort of, fate it as though some, big joint activity. The Chinese are the powerful one in this, no question at all. And we've seen, haven't we, through the last 2.75 years of this conflict, that China has, yes, certainly supported Russia, but has still been a moderating influence for all sorts of reasons. Not least potentially its own interests, potentially in Taiwan and elsewhere. But Putin, he's no fool. He will listen cautiously and carefully to what is coming out of what is being told by China.
And there's a lot of geostrategic questions, of course, about the conflict at the moment. But where exactly are Ukraine on the ground? What is the situation on the front line itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's not great. And we all know it hasn't been great for quite a number of months now. Steady incremental gains by the Russians. We think back to that little town that we all spent so much time talking about last year, Advika. Advika is about 25 kilometers behind Russian lines now. When we talk about small gains, I mean they are small gains, but 25 kilometers is no longer just a field or two or a tree line. They are incrementally taking Ukrainian territory. And they're doing so at huge cost. We know that. There's talk of still maybe a 1,000 casualties a day. Those are huge numbers. Now we know that Mother Russia has a extraordinary ability to suffer or to absorb loss of troops, but nonetheless, those are very significant numbers of troops. But they are making gains incrementally, and the Ukrainians are tired and they are finding it hard to resist that. And so there's no doubt the tactical and the operational level of momentum continues to lie with the Russians. There's then the kind of angle of what's going up in Kursk, which, for me, it was a really smart move by Zelensky, really changed the calculus of the war, because something's got to change. And taking some sovereign Russian territory in the name of self-defense struck me as a really smart strategic move, if he can hold it, because it gives him something when the music stops and we get some kind of frozen conflict and it becomes more about the talking than the fighting. Having a piece of sovereign Russia gives him something to genuinely barter with. It makes Putin look weak. Now, unfortunately, even there, it appears that the Ukrainians have lost about half of what they held in Ukraine, in Kursk. They need to cling on to that for dear life, because actually it doesn't matter how much of sovereign Russia they're holding, they've just got to hold something. So having made the gamble of going into Russia, for me, that would be a real priority, just to defend that line. So long answer to your question. Fundamentally, on the battlefield, it is proving pretty challenging for the Ukrainians at the moment.
And President Biden has announced that the G7 plans to send 50 billion in loans to Ukraine using Russian assets. How important is that support going to be, and where might Ukraine find use for that money in the war?
Yeah, I mean, all international support is good support. But what's it hiding? It's hiding a continuing caveated support to the Ukrainians. So Zelensky's victory plan didn't get the great, support he hoped for. There's still restrictions on the use of long-range weapons. It feels as though, it's moderated support. There's talk of the Germans and the French reducing the amount that they're supporting. So great, 50 billion. I mean, what's not to like about that? But as has always been the case, converting money into battlefield capability is not a quick pastime. And of course, Zelensky will be very grateful for the money, and it'll be readily spent, and I hope effectively. Uh, but it doesn't fundamentally change Zelensky's conundrum, which is that his best opportunity in this war came about 18 months ago, and it slipped away through his hands, in part through some tactical errors of not exploiting situations, but much more to the point because of delays by the West at a critical moment. And by the time those delays played themselves out, you're into, you can make World War One analogies if you find that helpful, but a very heavily defended front line that runs for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, and that's as it was in 1914, 1915, 16. It remains breaking through that as a defensive line is incredibly difficult, and the Ukrainians have found that to their cost. And of course, what they can't do is throw the sorts of troops at the problem that the Russians can, nor can they throw the artillery ammunition at it that the Russians can. And so, you've got to begin to ask yourself, what is the play? What is the next play that allows Ukraine to change the calculus? Kursk certainly did that to some degree. But what they're not managing to do at the moment is stem the tide on the Eastern Front, on the battlefield, where they've got to re-strengthen the line. And there's been a little bit of evidence the Ukrainians deliberately withdrawing, which is a perfectly valid military activity. They did around Vodovar. Of course, it's difficult to do when it's your own sovereign territory. When you're fighting on somebody else's territory, withdrawing, giving up terrain is a very sound tactical method. You fall back to something more defensible. You buy time. That's very hard to do when it's your country, it's your people ceding terrain in that way. But what you would typically do is you would prepare stronger defenses further back and fall back to them, and then you hold the line, and you then use that as a mechanism to then prepare to go on the offense. As a much harder for the Ukrainians to do that because it's their sovereign territory, and secondly, it continues to be hard to see where their offensive play comes, in part because the West has been so mealy-mouthed, frankly, in terms of the support they've given and the caveats they've placed on that support, and the fact that Ukrainians are just tired.
And we talked about the support for Ukraine. Is it possible that this money could be used as part of this strategy that appears to be emerging of getting Ukraine to produce its own weapons, its own missiles, and in a way, go around a lot of the limitations they have at the moment on long-range strikes, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And there's been a strategy all the way through the conflict that you want Ukraine's war machine to own this more and more, because they're then in control of the decisions. They're not just kind of subject to how many Leopard tanks various European nations. They can generate their own war machine, and they've done that very effectively, of course, haven't they? In some areas, so development drones, for example, light disposable, fast turn technology. They've done this. So that is undoubtedly good, but it's long term, and there's talk, isn't there, of is this somehow trying to Trump proof things to give Ukraine more independence? And I think that is right, but it's not a quick move. I should just say, there is talk as well about the degree to which, at some point, the attrition against the Russians will begin to take its toll. Not so much in terms of troops. They seem to have a ready supply of conscripts who are just ordered into the fight to be sacrificed. But they are losing huge amounts of equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, and the like. And those they don't have limitless stocks of. They have huge stocks, but my God, they've lost a lot of them. And there's a question about, will they at some point begin to struggle because they haven't even got the supporting vehicles to go with those troops to throw into the line? And one of the great advantages the Russians have had all along is the quantity of artillery they throw at the Russians' artillery, the so-called God of War. Earlier this year, the estimates were that they were out artillery firing the Ukrainians by a ratio of about 10-1. The assessment is that's down to a ratio of about 2.5-1. That's not because the Russians have lost interest in artillery. It is because somewhere along the line their supply chain is struggling to keep pace.
I did want to pick up there on your point about the impact in Russia. It's been noted that a significant amount of inflation in Russia is being caused by these large sign-up bonuses offered to Russians who join the army. Are there signs like that the impact of the war is starting to come home to Moscow?
Well, I mean, I think that of course has to be part of the hope that somewhere along the line, Russia as a state finds it intolerable, difficult to continue the war effort. And there's any number of reasons that could be the case, whilst they on the face have got a limitless supply of humans to throw into the fight. But does the moral dynamic, do the mothers of Russia, do they make their voice heard so much? Putin isn't infallible in office. At some point, does the amount of GDP that he's pumping into defense anyway, and then the impact of the war on the wider economy begin to take a real toll on his supporters, on the price of a loaf of bread and the like, and that slowly he gets undermined from within. That has to be the strategic play. Of course it does. And to some degree, that's been the strategic play all along. But Ukraine and the West can't bank on that being the path because it's to some degree out of their control, because they can kind of create factors, but they can't really shape Russia's real resilience to these things. You got to hope that they become vulnerable to it, but it is hope. You can't. There's not a direct cause and effect. If we do this, food prices go up, the economy does this, and it all falls apart. You begin getting things that outwit your ability to be certain of influencing, in the same way as you can influence things on the battlefield. If you've got the right assets, you do the right thing.
Major General Rupert Jones, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Louis, an absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you very much for watching Frontline on Times Radio. For more, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can read the latest news on thetimes.com or listen to Times Radio. Thank you. Goodbye.